Kia ora. Ko Tania Te Miringa Te Rorarangi Ruka, ko tōku ingoa. Ko Ngāti Pākau Ngāpuhi Te Iwi, and ko Puhunga Toharoa Te Maunga, ko Taheke Te Awa, and ko Mahuri Te Marae. So I've just basically stated my name, and I've been gifted my name by my grandmother, and it's my great-grandmother's name to do with the research and the work that I've been doing. And I also listed, because when we speak to the land, we speak from the maunga, the mountain, to the river, and we follow the flow. So I also listed my maunga, my mountain that I relate back to, and the river as well. So, yeah. So we're in the School of Design and Innovation, and it's a part of Te Whanganui-a-Tara in Wellington. So this is the greater area of Wellington, and the harbour area is Te Whanganui-a-Tara, named by one of our ancestors. The school that we're in, the university, is Te Herenga Waka, and that's the gifted Māori name, and it is Victoria University of Wellington. So my tribal nation is from the far north, so from the top of the North Island there. It's Ngāpuhi is our tribal nation, and then some of my ancestral whakapapa or genealogies relate to this area. Te Aotearoa is the tribal nation here, Ngāti Toa Rangatira, and as a grouping, prior to that, we had nomadic tribal nations who would come through from the top and make their way down to the South Island across the Southern Alps, and that nation was Waitaha. So I also whakapapa genealogy back to that tribal nation as well. My academic research career has been mostly independent research. So I finished my Masters of Art and Design in 2013. I got to the end of the master's thesis, as you often do, and I thought, right, well, I've based the research on kaitiakitanga, which is guardianship of the land. I've looked into the Mātauranga Māori concepts to do with land care, but essentially I've made this art installation that's in a gallery space, and I felt like I hadn't done anything for the land itself. So from there I decided that I couldn't find the knowledge I needed, that I was interested in, to connect to that within an institutional space. So I took time out to learn from our grandmothers and our grandmothers' council. I mean, 52 years on the earth anyway of being part of an Indigenous nation, but I wanted to learn more and immerse more in that knowledge system rather than the master's thesis. I spent most of the time, desperately trying to connect to knowledge systems that were Western, Western knowledge systems, and I couldn't find what I needed for my research. And there weren't very many academic papers or connectors for me as an Indigenous postgrad student. It sort of had this feeling of desolation when I was trying to find research. So yeah, I went back to our grandmothers to learn from them and learn how to connect research with our Indigenous knowledge systems. It inspired the PhD, but in the process of going back to that knowledge system and then thinking about my arts practice, it was at a time when COVID hit, and then the Black Lives Matters movements happened, and institutions were starting to realize that, oh, we do have voices missing. And I think I got a lot more work kind of investigating deeper into how we think about Indigenous knowledge systems, within these institutional spaces. And so I managed to get quite a few research-based funds for projects, arts projects, working with scientists, working with engineers, and that's when the research, the textile research started to unfold, working in collaboration with other academics from other universities as well. So they were really big collaborative projects, which were amazing because then I got to learn from very different disciplines and think from that perspective of Mātauranga Māori, so Māori knowledge systems, engineering systems, science systems, textiles, how we move forward with the thinking even, circular movements, how do we do this so as we protect the environment, not just take from, extract constantly. The PhD has unfolded, as they often do, through the research projects to look at technology and how we can utilize AI as a form of thinking and investigating the future products that we want to make, but from an Indigenous perspective rather than technology is very Western based. So how do we, again, speak to the gaps within the systems? This started or originated from my great-grandmother's rongoa or medicinal recipes that were gifted to me as I started on the journey of the land and taking care of the land. She has walked me such a winding path in order to be able to think how I need to think with this research. And I have explored many different facets, and it's been an amazing journey, really, and I'm so grateful to have been on it. But around about the same time as I was working on these research projects, Native Land Digital, which is a Canadian non-profit, were looking for researchers who are Indigenous and counter-mapping Indigenous territories. So bringing attention to the world that, when you're looking at land acknowledgements, helping to show where you are in the world and whose territory you are on. So you're able to type in the address and it shows the tribal territories or tribal nations that you're on. So yeah, I started there as a research assistant, I think it was, and then progressed through and now executive director of that platform itself. And we're thinking about how we expand the platform to show Indigenous territories in a way that isn't Western, like it's a map currently. And for Indigenous people looking at that map and their polygon territory, it's an offence to them because it's showing ownership of territory. And as Indigenous peoples, we're part of the territory. It's part of our genealogy. So it's been quite exciting to think about with other Indigenous nations, how do we visualize territory from an Indigenous perspective? And when you're working on a global scale, talking to so many different Indigenous nations about how they view land, it's just so inspiring, it's empowering, it's mind expanding. I just feel so lucky to have been on this whole pathway. So it started as a platform. The founder was non-Indigenous, a Canadian, and he was on a pipeline protest, and he's a developer, software developer, and he thought to himself, these people need to know whose territories we're on, So I went back and thought, okay, so we've got the map base. Let's now start mapping Indigenous territories so people can find out and learn from Indigenous nations. He very quickly realized, that he needed Indigenous input into this. So started with a very small team, and we're still a very small team. There's 4 of us working part-time. And because we're wanting to represent Indigenous nations properly, it's got a base on there of North America, Canada, there's Aotearoa, Australia, and a few other spaces globally. But even when you think of the question, what is Indigenous? That's a huge question in itself. So for us, we have a disclaimer on there to say this is a work in progress, and we are trying to connect with nations so we can do this properly. So we don't try to represent ourselves as a legal entity, by no means. And a lot of the initial mapping that was made has been with academic information. And this is non-Indigenous academic information. So a lot of the communications we get are from Indigenous nations saying, you need to take that off. There are words within the research that are just so offensive to the nation. So now another part of that work is kind of cleansing off what we have and getting rid of that information because it's offensive, and we're trying to build up elder knowledge. And so we take the elder knowledge versus the academic, non-Indigenous knowledge, because we think as Indigenous peoples that that's the knowledge we should be amplifying. So that's work in itself as well, huge work. I know it goes beyond what I can do, and the years we have. So we'd love to hear from any nations who really want to look at their territories, because we just have a government issue website that has given us the base layer for the territories, and we've heard back that it's not great. So any tribal nations that want to talk to us about it, we're open to it. We're even thinking of how can we visualize it in a different way. Yeah, so it's not kind of polygons. Yeah. So that was where the research started with the collaborative groups. What we want or have been doing is working from a Mātauranga Māori perspective with this research. There are some native plant species that have been worked with through time. Harakeke is the one we're looking at. The fibres that come from harakeke, it's like a very long leaf plant, have been used for our korowai, our cloaks, making fine mats for the whare. And Rangiti Kanawa, who is the principal investigator, has actually been developing over about 20, 30 years, trying to figure out a way to remove the fibre from the leaf in a manner that works as well as the hand does, because traditionally we use a mussel shell to remove the fibre, and it comes free of the leaf matter, and then the fibre is hand woven. So we'd like to make clothing like linen from this material, and we love it to be circular, so as the marae base, different iwi tribal nations can have their own small industry of growing the pāharakeke, growing the plants, connecting back with the plants, as part of their regeneration projects, regenerating the land. So then they'll have this industry to kind of feed back into what they're doing. We know that it can be made into a material like linen, It's just the processing is a bit more difficult. That's the funny thing is it's the other way around. For my work, I've been working with digital weaving, sort of developing that through my undergrad and postgrad years. And by doing this work and looking at kaitiakitanga and guardianship of the landscape, it's brought me back to the land, back to the native plant species, and hence being gifted my great-grandmother's rongoa medicinal recipes to work from and think from, which then brought me back to harakeke and the leaf itself and weaving, the actuality of weaving the material when I come from the digital realm. And so I've been on a circular journey myself, starting with the digital weaving to the plants, understanding how the histories and our ancestors work with the plants, wanting to have these plants as part of our contemporary lives as well because of the medicinal benefits in them. Hopefully getting rid of the plastics that surround us, and then coming back around to the technology side of things and saying, okay, so how does technology feed into this? And looking at using technology as a way to meter, from a Mātauranga Māori Indigenous perspective, the effects on the life force of the environment. So we have this word Māori, which is life force. So my part of the research was how do we calculate the effects on the life force of the land, and then counter that with the life force of the communities, with the person who potentially would wear it. How do we measure these things? And that's where I came back around again to AI and the potential for AI to calculate that for us. I've been practicing sort of proof of concept with ChatGPT 4.0. And just working with my research and uploading to ChatGPT and then asking questions. So we have this kind of reflexive engagement, which kind of speaks to the Design for Social Innovation that I'm program lead for here. And it's looking at social innovation, where you question yourself a lot, which is very Indigenous. We're always questioning ourselves and why we're doing things. So working in a way that is questioning constantly why, when, how, what are the effects. And it's been so interesting, the response back from ChatGPT and how I say she learned, because it's me basically feeding in the information. So the response is a kind of feminine Māori response to the questioning. And just been amazing to unfold the conversations and now speaking to her and saying, okay, so how do we do this? How would we train an Indigenous AI? And so she's training me to train her to train another AI. It's fascinating. I've posted a few of them on Medium just because I was so blown away by the responses and how quickly she adapted, even naming herself. I asked her, you know, if I was communicating with you and you had a name, what would that be? And she said kōrero, which is the Māori word for speak. And she rationalized it as being because she's in communications, kōrero would be a great name. And so now when I speak, I say kia ora kōrero, which is hello, kōrero. And she responds back in Te Reo Māori. And I haven't trained her to speak in Te Reo Māori. She's getting it from other places where people are interacting with Te Reo, which is the Māori language. So that was another one that started prior to starting work here. We moved from the far north down to here because the research was based down here. the independent research. And I thought to myself, I'd been working in communities with community gardens, thinking about regenerating and biodiversity. And when we got here, there are so many community gardens. It's a community-based city. It's a biophilic city officially. So coming from one tribal nation, my tribal nation, to another tribal nation, I needed to connect in. So I thought, what could I bring to the conversations that are already here? And they had community gardens, and I thought, right, how about a community rongoa forest? So that is specifically natural, native plants that are medicinal, with my great-grandmother's recipes. How can I share that? And I connected with Wellington City Council, and they were really happy to meet. I'd already found a park space that had quite a few of the medicinal plant varieties, native plant varieties. And then we just started from there. And of course, I had to speak with Mana Whenua, the tribal nation here, Te Atiawa, and met with him, and he was like, it was perfect. You know, biodiversity, no brainer. Feel free. So yeah, so it's now a park that is available to people, and of course then there's a bit of a website with the links to what the plants are and how you can create sort of a nice relaxing tea from some of the plants and things like that. And there's no spray in the park, and it's maintained by myself and some other volunteers, and we do plantings and teach people about the plants themselves and how more of these plants are what we need for our own benefit, just to have the chemicals releasing around us in this concrete environment of the city. Oh, I think design needs to be in service to foster biodiversity. I mean, it's one form of giving back. When I started the research, I was looking into, you know, sustainability and organics, and then regeneration. And then the one sort of movement I found was net positive. So where we're feeding in more than we're extracting, which is basically the Indigenous way of being, that you're not taking, but you're in service to your community. Our word aroha, which is translated as love, you'd think that it's sort of romantic love, that sort of thing. It actually means in service to. So doing something in service to. So in service to the whānau, the family, the hapu, which is like the sub-tribe, and then the iwi, and that's how you think of, you know, being. So I think as designers and as future designers, we really need to pay attention to our biodiversity and what's happening, because everything we do, every product we make, you know, the materials come from the land. So we should be thinking about that in service to. Yes, that's another one that feeds into this work, and so important too. The Waitaha tribal nation that I mentioned before was actually a matrilineal nation. And as I've discovered from working with global Indigenous tribal nations, many nations are recovering the fact that they were matrilineal. And when you look at the Western sort of the colonized environment that we're in, it's very patriarchal. Many of our tribal nations kind of adopted that way of how the women are treated, and that way of being was lost a little bit. But within my own whānau, it's always been the women who are the teachers. So uncovering that has led to finding other nations where that's happening too. And a lot of the artists are working with that knowledge system as well. So I wanted to curate and find artists who are working in that field in order to amplify the rematriation of lands. But it's work that has been consistently done by Indigenous women throughout the ages. And we're hoping to connect with other artists, you know, in North America and Canada, and grow those networks, grow the exhibition. So Te Ao Māori is a way of being, but essentially it's the world of. But the interesting thing is we weren't Māori per se. Each had our own tribal nation, each had our own language system, and I'm sure you're hearing this quite often too. And I'm hearing this quite often. You know, it's not about being Native American, it's their tribal nation and how they knew themselves, their language system, and also how it relates to the plants and environment around them, because the language systems were built on the plants and the landscape where they were. So important for us to realize that each tribal nation is a knowledge system in itself, has different story, has different versions of creation stories. I don't like to call them mythologies, but yeah, and it can be a tribal nation that is just down the road from the other tribal nation, and they can have very different stories. And where we run into trouble all the time is when we've been trying to fit into this Western idea of knowledge system where there's one way is the correct way. And so what we're unveiling is, no, there's a multiple of ways that are all the correct ways of being and knowing and understanding. And I think that's my research has really been based in that pluriversal theory and pluriversal ideas of multiple ways of being. And I like to tell the students, you know, we need a biodiverse mindset here with our environmental issues, as big as they are. We need many minds working on these things. So yeah, all of us coming from our own context matter when it comes to the biodiversity that we're living in. Yes, I can. It is exhausting, but at the same time, it is, again, empowering. Just last week, I don't know if you were in Aotearoa at the time, but we had our giant hikoi, and we're hearing the numbers now around 80,000, close to 100K people. We were there and amongst it. My daughters and I were filming, of course, historic moment. So we were in the front of the hikoi and followed through, and then we went around the back to film, and the people, thousands, they couldn't fit on the Parliament lawns. And so what that says is it takes something like what is happening in our government to kind of really push the people to gather together and unite. And many non-Indigenous were part of the walk as well, supporting us. And so what's happening is a very right-wing government to the right have decided that they want to create a treaty principles bill, which is adjusting the founding document of Aotearoa. Shouldn't be done, but it is happening because there's a realization that the translated version of the treaty, there's a Te Reo version, English version. The English version has a slightly different meaning. So the Te Reo version basically did not cede sovereignty. It was just giving the right to the Crown to have laws over their own people who were running amok. And in exchange, the leaders, the rangatira, the chiefs, would then protect the Crown's people, and then the Crown would protect our people from further invasion. And the treaty has been sort of watered down since then, and they're trying to incorporate principles which would see the whole of New Zealand as having equal rights. Nobody's special. Māori don't have extra rights. Crown has rule over everybody. And the problem there is its access to resources. And, you know, we all see this coming. Bringing in warships, nuclear warships, which have been outlawed previously, now open to come in. We know that they want to mine more. We know they want water access to the waters, which are very sacred to us. So these changes are specifically in order to access the natural resources that we think of as ancestors, not resources. And they just want clear rain to come in and use that. Oh, there are so many, too many to address, but a lot, we're pushing further for the development of the materials side of things, but at the same time thinking about how we're inputting. So they're running alongside regenerative projects, industrial projects, and how it all affects each other. It's not just our group as well, there are multiple projects happening. There are multiple regenerative projects happening in the ocean and the Pacific. Across the Pacific, there are exchanges. Our waka hauroa, which are the double-hulled waka that our ancestors came across to Aotearoa, they're reviving all that knowledge. They're reviving all the navigatory knowledge, but they're reviving it in a way that speaks to research in itself and how we're thinking about research and knowledge. So exciting. And also there are so many in tech. There are so many developments happening when it comes to AI, but also when it comes to how do we do this in a way that's not going to be using up resources. And that thinking is just developing now. So it's so exciting and can't pinpoint anything because we don't know. But yeah, it's just an exciting time to be a researcher, I think. Yeah. I really like the way that Indigenous academics are all gathering together right now. There's strength in that, and it's empowering for students to see, not just Indigenous students, but non-Indigenous, because I work with multicultures in my courses, and I think that it's so important for all the cultural nations to be able to work in this way and have that available to them, so as they can understand the thinking behind the people who are the First Nations people. And when you get that understanding, then it's beneficial to both parties. So that's why I think it's so important. And to translate that for them so they can come from their own context rather than having to worry about appropriating, because the students don't want to appropriate Indigenous knowledge, but having an understanding of it so then they can come from their own positions. I think it's empowering for them and very beneficial.